Okay, this is the second video on Plato, and it's about how our system got corrupted, and to the point where we elected Critias, who became a dictator and um, led a rule of terror for 9 months. So, of course, we have lots of history after that and lots of ups and downs, but I told my story in my dialogues and in my educational system. I tried to show, first of all, what a flourishing society would be like, the institutions, the kinds of activities, and then how it can get lost, so that people would learn the lessons, both of what sorts of things they should create and sustain, and also what sort of vices and extremes they should avoid, so that human beings can flourish. They have to have flourishing cultures. They have to have good institutions, good societies, or they can't flourish. Okay, so on this quick and easy version, um, we were we were attacked by the Persians. Let's just start there. The Persians had a system where one person dressed up like a demigod and everybody else was supposed to worship him. So the people did not have opportunities to cultivate their natural powers of soul. And we thought this was a really much more primitive kind of association. People were not, people have natural capacities for all these other sacred passions and kinds of achievements of culture and community and creativity and science, invention, discovery. But in Persia, nobody was given any power to exercise those powers. So we were threatened, obviously, and you could say it was just a power struggle, but I, Plato, thought it was also about civilization. And so we fought bravely. We really did think we had the gods on our side. Some of the soldiers, of course, took it literally. I just took it that the we have the human condition. We have our understanding of the good life is better, and that's what we should be fighting for. We have a better idea on our side, and a better society, better laws and institutions and habits on our side. So what happened? We worked with the Spartans especially. The Spartans had a very different kind of culture than we did, but we worked with them against the Persians. As long as we had a common enemy, we worked together because we agreed on that. And there was the battle at Thermopylae, and there was so in general, what we did was we were outnumbered 8-1. But the Persians were kind of lazy and assumed they were going to win too. And so we did the tricky things. We did the passive aggressive kinds of things. We let the Persians, gave them the impression we were running away, and got them to go into a mountain pass. And then we surrounded them and just killed them off. So that was good. Their pride got the best of them. Then also they were in the Bay of Salamis, and we had smaller ships than they did, but we just closed off both ends of the bay and sort of starved them out, partly. And then we just had these very, the little guy way of irritating the big guys and then eventually destroying them. So those little terrorist cells that we had, we worked through strategy. We were smart, and eventually we won. So that was a great celebration. But even before the Persians actually went home, the Greek city-states, when they no longer had a common enemy, they start looking at each other. And the two most powerful city-states after the war against Persia were Athens and Sparta. And the Spartans hated the Athenians and vice versa. Each one thought the other one was a bunch of barbarians. So the Spartans valued victory in war, and patriotism was their ultimate value. As Aristotle said, their whole society was structured around that. And the Athenians thought that national security is not the ultimate goal, that war is for the sake of peace, that national security is necessary, just like eating is necessary. Being safe is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We only eat and we keep safe so that we can do all these other wonderful things. That's the sufficient condition for life. That's our real nature. But Sparta was organized in a way that people didn't cultivate those higher order capacities. Instead, every young boy was sent to military school at age 7, and he was taught to live for the sake of his city-state. And they had a, huge military operation, and the city honored bravery in war, and you got promoted if you were a good soldier. You went to general, and they had a council of elders who were 80 years old, who made all the rules, and there was no immigration and no emigration. Well, of course, the Athenians, they had people coming and going all the time. They had all these foreigners come in. They were international, and they were curious about ideas, and they were curious about trading with everybody. And they were, they had their tragedy and their creativity and their architecture and their sculpture, and they had their sciences. They had all their scientists out on the islands speculating about the nature of the universe. They had sophisticated medicine. Up at Epidaurus, they were working out a combination of, if somebody got sick in Epidaurus, first they went to, they ate a certain kind of herb that had been carefully, empirically discovered to create dreams, and they went into a sweat lodge and they tried to have dreams to see what the gods were telling them, and then they had all sorts of other potions and therapies and drugs that had been worked out through scientific reasoning, and they had sophisticated medicine. So they were flourishing. The Athenians were flourishing in many ways, and so they thought the Spartans were just a more primitive form of society, so they were very threatened by them. And the Spartans were threatened by the Athenians, and the other city-states couldn't care less. Like, they didn't want to get involved, obviously. I mean, what's it to me? I don't care. Why don't you guys just kill each other and we'll just stay home? But of course, that's not what happened. They created power blocks, and they forced every city-state to take sides. And it was because either you're for us or you're against us. If we don't make you one of our allies, Sparta will come and make you their ally, or they'll think we're too weak to be able to make you our ally, and they'll come after us. So we have to show Sparta that we're powerful enough to force people to be in our power block, and then we have to show Sparta what a big power block we have, and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So the other city-states are unhappy about this, and Athens and Sparta are building these leagues, right? And Athens is basically the aggressor. And Athens should have won in this war, the Peloponnesian War, but the Athenians got a little too full of themselves. So there were a whole lot of problems with this wonderful democratic society. First of all, the Parthenon, right, with the temple to Athena and the law court and the theater tonight. Who paid for that? Where do they get the money to buy all these monuments to democracy? Well, they got it from the spoils of war. Oh, well, but we're all fighting for democracy, right? So we're killing people and stealing their stuff because we're so democratic and we believe in freedom and equality. Oh, yeah, sure. And then their allies, they taxed their allies so that they could build these monuments to democracy. So, of course, they crippled everybody else but the Athenians in anybody else's capacity to build up a nice democratic society with these institutions and leisure time and all this good stuff. They made it much harder for their enemies by um, taking, the spoils of war, and they made it harder for their allies by taxing them so much. So, yes, these tributes to democracy were a little bit on the hypocritical side. Um, they were vindictive toward their enemies, so they created more enemies. Their allies didn't like them. Their allies were somewhat afraid of them. They they just had a double standard, the way they treated each other or claimed to treat each other, and then the way they treated any non-Athenian. And of course the justification was, well, they're not as civilized as us, so somehow it's justified. um, what happened in the educational system, this was where Plato really worried about that. um, he thought, he shows in his dialogues that the heart of the corruption, or at least the part of it that he cared about most, was the educational system. And what happened was, foreigners were brought in from elsewhere to teach, to educate the youth. And they started this system of what was called an education of a gentleman. Liberal arts education. So you're supposed to be learning how to be a gentleman, how to be a good citizen. Well, it was actually the opposite of that. And they started to get paid to do it. So before that, young people were paired with older people, and this is during a war, so middle-aged people tended to be off at war or running the city. So the elder generation would pair with the younger generation and give them guidance and be kind of their guardians, give them advice, and educate them in how to be a good person, and then also educate them in academic kind of stuff. But it was this other kind of education in decency and morality that was important. And then that changed, and sophists started coming in from outside of Athens, and these people didn't have any stake in the future of Athens. I mean, they didn't really care what happened to the city because they're not citizens. So what they started doing was teaching the young people how to speak persuasively. And the parents of the young people started paying them quite a bit of money to teach this skill. Well, if you think about it, given that public policy is determined by the vote in the assembly, and the assembly is made up of people chosen by lot, they just randomly are chosen, a certain number of citizens, and those citizens come and listen to the people in power, people with position, have to persuade them whether or not to go to war, whether or not to engage in this campaign or that campaign, whether or not to send this many ships or that many ships, how to get food, how to run the city. I mean, all transportation, healthcare, all the issues that the assembly had to vote on. And so, of course, knowing the power of speaking persuasively is going to make a difference in your ability to exercise power, to get elected, and to get done what you want to get done. The other part was the court system, is the jurors. When the citizens were acting as jurors, once again, they're chosen by lot. And the point was to try and get people to be educated about citizenship. But when the sophists started teaching the art of persuasion, in relation to the jury, they taught all these logical fallacies, how to manipulate people, how to distract them, how to appeal to emotions. And it's so ironic because in tragedy, you see the two differences in the way the educated class uses speech. Hecuba is a great example. She argues reasonably with Odysseus, and she's talking to him about how he could talk to his people and reason with them and convince them that you don't need to kill an innocent young girl. Achilles wouldn't like that. It's not a good reason to fight. You should fight for hospitality. You shouldn't fight for sex. Anyway, Hecuba alludes to how you should speak to your citizens in a way that will educate them. And then, a little while later, she herself abuses speech and the power of persuasion and persuades Agamemnon to do what he shouldn't do by committing all these logical fallacies. Well, so the tragedians are obviously trying to educate the masses, the citizens, to make those distinctions so that they're not manipulated by trained rhetoricians, either in the jury or in the assembly. But Pericles brought in these sophists who were paid tons of money to develop that capacity to manipulate, cajole, to get whatever you happen to want, whether it's just or not. And it's interesting, Plato's dialogues have Socrates talking to a number of different sophists. And they are so ignorant, or so much into denial about the effect that this tool that they're handing down to the best and the brightest, or the not best, the young people from the generation of aristocratic families, they're so oblivious to what the future will hold when the next generation of leaders wants to get this tool of the power of persuasion without any interest in learning about justice or virtue, and what they'll do with it. So, but the sophists are foreigners; they don't have anything invested, and that's got to be a real problem. So the courts were corrupted, the legal profession was corrupted. People became lawyers and got paid tons of money to defend the rich who got accused of some crime, so to manipulate the jurors so that they could get off, they wouldn't get punished. They also, so the legal system was corrupted by greed and by the desire for power. The assembly was corrupted by the desire for power. And this again was the Achaeans' big problem, is that they could not resist the opportunity to have power. And this is what's happening to the Athenians, as if they hadn't learned anything from all these stories. But some Athenians tried to wrap the system around their little finger to get rich, some powerful. Some interpreted democratic freedom to mean the freedom to live however I like. And Plato talks about the democratic personality. And he says, oh, he just, he'll stuff himself one day and starve himself the next day, and study music one day, study, train for athletics another day, and maybe he'll pick up politics for a little while and think he's saying something when he's saying nothing. He'll flatter himself that he actually knows something. And he lives happily, right? He thinks he's so free. Okay, so this is the dissipation of energies and capacities on the part of too many citizens who just understood democracy as freedom, as license. They didn't have the discipline. They didn't develop expertise, professional expertise. They didn't take on all the headaches of, of exercising power for the well-being of the ruled. It's not easy. And they just were too lazy, and that was okay because they lived in a free city. They could do that. So between the people who wanted to take the city to war for power, the people who wanted to take the city to war for wealth, the people who were completely dissipated and didn't provide any leadership, and when they didn't, there were still plenty of leadership roles that had to be filled. So people that were either power hungry or greedy or incompetent or corrupt filled in those roles. They were not filled in by people who were ruling for the well-being of the ruled. And so eventually the city fell apart because the city was structured around the cultivation of practical wisdom. That was the responsibility of the citizens, and if they weren't going to do it, they weren't going to be able to keep their city. But they were in total denial about that. So the theater was corrupted. People didn't like tragedy. It's too unpleasant. They preferred comedy. They kind of liked Aristophanes, who made fun of everyone and everything, including Socrates. He also, in the Symposium, is portrayed as very crude. He vulgarized people's taste. He just vulgar. People became more vulgar instead of trying to be excellent. And then also, you can imagine that people, the kind of discussions people would get to after a tragedy was performed. Well, if the people's character is being corrupted, their discussions about what the lesson was or which character you liked were going to be corrupt. They were going to defend a mistake in judgment. They were, you can imagine that at the end of an evening of tragedy and conversation, you end up worse off than you were because you've been miseducated. People have told you, interpreted the play in a way that is leading you farther away from good judgment than you would have been if you just stayed home. They're not being true to the writers. And they might deliberately be manipulating. They might just say, I don't agree with Sophocles. He's just an old fuddy-duddy. He's just stuck in the past. We're beyond that now, or something. Or they could say, no, I think Sophocles really was trying to teach the lesson of self-pity, and when you get old you get bitter, and that's just the way it is, or something. I can imagine, given the way people interpret the Bible, given the way they interpret movies, or movies about the Bible, you name it, it's not easy to imagine when the city is starting to fall apart from within, from the souls of the citizens. They're not going to be learning from tragedy. However they resist the learning, it doesn't matter. There'd be 32 flavors of how they could manage not to learn what's in front of their face. Also, you have to remember that it was the council that picked the top 3 tragedians, and then they performed, and the people voted on which one they liked. So maybe if the council members are corrupt, they're going to pick three that weren't as good, and then among those three, maybe the masses, the citizens will vote for the wrong one, or they'll vote for the right one for the wrong reason. Anyway, basically, once judgment starts getting corrupted, it just keeps getting more and more corrupted. There's a synchronistic effect. The Olympics were another institution where people came together, made laws, and I have a video, or I'm planning to do a video on how the Olympics tried to cultivate all these powers of soul, just like Delphi did. And but what happened in the Olympics, as the character of people became more degenerate, they would people would go to watch, and it was just party time. They would go and party and drink and carouse, and it was pretty degenerate on the part of a lot of the spectators. Then on the part of the athletes, it became a highly specialized operation. So when you go to Olympia, you can see they have these, it looks like a sickle actually, but it was to rub. Okay, so every athlete had three people, an entourage, okay? They had their coach, or the head guy, that would figure out an exact athletic program for them. Given their sport and their particular capacities, they would need X number of minutes of X kind of exercise, and Y number of minutes of this or that or that. So they would set out the plan. Then there was the athletic trainer who actually stood by the athlete and got him to do everything the coach had said had to be done. And they put oil on their body while they were exercising, and grease is very dry and dusty. So you have these little sickle-looking things that scraped the dirty oil off the athlete. So it's become this huge thing. And Plato talks about this in the Republic. The athletes themselves do not have holistic health or wellness. They're pretty specialized. If they don't get enough sleep, they get sick, or if they get off their regimen. So their bodies are totally tuned to something that's very artificial. So the Olympics got corrupted. Most of the Athenians were couch potatoes. They were drinking too much. They were eating too much. They were paying doctors to keep them from suffering the natural consequences of their intemperance. And the whole notion of a sound mind and a sound body was completely corrupted. And the city-states also, instead of spending money for health and wellness of the citizens, they saved all this money, and every 4 years they had this huge spectacle. So they just completely splurged on when it was their turn to have the Olympics, instead of the point of the Olympics, which was the health and wellness of the citizens. Okay, in relationship to the Agora, the Hephaestus, the god of crafts, he was corrupted, and it was the story of Aphrodite, his wife. She was always insanely attracted to Ares, the god of war, and so she would cheat on Hephaestus. She would run away and have sex with Ares, and then, they couldn't stand each other because sex and aggression, it was just too much. He was too sexually aggressive, and she was sexually aggressive, but they got to be just too much, and so they'd separate. She'd come back home to Hephaestus. But that got corrupted because the Athenians got greedy, so they became they made treaties. Their economic treaties were more and more self-interested, and as I said, they taxed their allies and they took the spoils of war, and they created these unjust treaties because they were getting greedy. So international trade was not creating friendship bonds, it was creating animosity. Um, and then they were also becoming greedy for power, and those two go together. If you're greedy for wealth, you create animosity, and that creates wars over resources. But there were other Athenians that just wanted to build a military empire. But it's the same kind of overreaching, the same kind of intemperance, desire for more than your share. And Hephaestus then, instead of using his gifts to make a well-crafted household and a city and beautiful monuments and sculpture and architecture and all that wonderful stuff, he spends more and more time at the forge making swords and shields for war. And then I told the whole story about his armor and Achilles' armor, and then Achilles' second set of armor and all that stuff. But that's an abuse of his skill, that we weren't given those skills to make war. We were given them to have the good life. And so when it gets corrupted, it gets reduced to war for the sake of war. Okay, the marketplace in the Agora, what was getting sold was more and more excessive things, things based on unnecessary desires, conspicuous consumption, and also the international flavor of it. Instead of tolerance and understanding and curiosity about other cultures, it led to moral relativism. It's like, oh, they have this kind of God and we have that kind of God, and oh, well, the gods are just made up by people and they don't exist anyway. Or they believe in this is virtuous and this is vice, and we believe blah blah, and so actually it's all relative. It's just socially constructed. So instead of leading to international culture, it could have led, or the two other options are, nobody believes in anything, relativism, or just my city state, right or wrong, just a kind of blind patriotism, just using your knowledge of other cultures in order to explain better why your society is best, and therefore you have some sort of right to try and conquer other people. Then the other issue was, if people are going to the Agora for the marketplace of ideas, that the quality of the conversation going on, the decisions, I mean, what the decisions made by the council about which issues to consider in what order could have been corrupted. The fact that certain decisions come up rather than others is a function of corruption. The jury coming in, their judgment is corrupted by the speakers. And then, so what gets posted, who's getting arrested for what? And what decisions were made in those cases, that gets corrupted. So the whole system, it can't survive except it has to be attached to the spirit of the people. So some institutions really just institutionally lend themselves to authoritarianism, but Athens didn't have that. The problem wasn't the institutional structure, it was the spirit, the desires of the people in the city. And none of them desired practical wisdom. And no matter how many institutions you build, if people don't want to use them for what they were meant to be used for, you're not going to get practical wisdom. And then it got to the point where people didn't even know that they were abusing these institutions. They really thought that the founders of Athens wanted people to have freedom to decide whatever they wanted to live for. It could be money, it could be power, it could be equality of pleasures to do whatever, license to do it. They thought the founders were aiming for that. And they thought that's what makes Athens so great. No, the founders were not aiming for that. They were aiming to cultivate practical wisdom, which requires the moral virtues. It requires an incredible amount of emotional maturity, discipline, intellectual education, and discipline, and focus, and continual examination of yourself and others. And the Athenians just totally lost it. So Poseidon, down at the bottom of the peninsula, he watched as the ships went out to battle against the Persians, which was a just war, but he also watched as the Athenians went out to battle the Spartans, and that was an unjust war. And so the city changed, fundamentally changed. Okay. So as the city started to deteriorate, people became less stable. One of the other big destabilizing events was that the Athenians, they didn't have their own, well, it's a dry country, rocky, so they couldn't grow their own food. And Sicily was like their breadbasket. And so Alcibiades, an arrogant guy, if there ever was one, a very talented but extremely aggressive Athenian, wanted to convince the Athenians that they should conquer Sicily so that they could have the food security. Basically, they would have a food source and they would have to stop worrying about it. And the trouble was, Nicias, who I talked to about before, he argued against that. He said, we're already fighting against Sparta on these other fronts. We really don't have enough ships, enough men, enough money to also conquer Sicily. The Sicilians are not going to want to be conquered, and they have all the advantages. They know the land. I mean, that's how we beat the Persians, is that they came after us, and we knew our land, and we had strategy. So of course the Sicilians are going to do the same thing to us. Nope. Alcibiades says, nope, we can do it. Nobody should tell the Athenians they can't do anything. So, of course, the assembly is flattered by Alcibiades, and they're full of themselves, and they're proud, and they're arrogant, and they make the wrong vote. And eventually, Athens loses. And the people are so destabilized, and they want to find someone to blame, right, for the loss of the war. And so the Spartans allow them to elect their own leader. They take their military away, right? They can't have any guns, but they can have their own society. What the heck? The Spartans don't want to govern them. So they elect. Okay, they have an election. Well, Critias, an uncle of Plato, gets up there and says, if you vote for me, I'm going to get Athens back to the good old days. I'm going to go back to when everybody was patriotic. Everybody believed in our city. Nobody was critical of our city. Everybody believed in the gods. And there weren't any of these raving atheists around. And there weren't any of these people who questioned the gods. And there wasn't any self-doubt. We were confident in ourselves. And we had family values. So family, country, and God. If you vote for me, I'm going to bring us back to the good old days. Well, they did vote for him. And Critias decided that all of his political enemies were evil, and he had justified in killing them off. He also thought all those foreigners were evil that were teaching relativism, like the sophists, so he kicked them out, killed them off. Then there were foreigners like Cephalus that Pericles had brought in to make swords and shields. Cephalus he was a very good businessman. He made a good product at a good price. He had 1,200 slaves or something. Very wealthy guy, because he was a good sword and shield maker. He was number one in the military-industrial complex, and he didn't care if Athens was fighting a just war or an unjust war. He didn't care if the city was gonna suffer for all this war. He didn't give them any advice. He just sold them armaments. And when Critias took over, Cephalus had died by then, but his sons were still around, and they didn't think anything of it. But Critias wanted to confiscate their wealth, and he said, those foreigners are taking advantage of us. He didn't blame the Athenians. The Athenians were the ones that voted to go to war and bought the swords and shields. No, you don't blame yourself, you blame the other guy. So let's blame the guy who makes them and who gets rich off of them. And so the Cephalus's sons, one of them was killed and one managed to escape, barely with his life. So basically it was a reign of terror for 9 months. And some of the Critias' political enemies managed to escape. They went to other city-states. They got the other city-states to marshal some armies, and they came back and they overthrew Critias. But the point is that Athens had it all, and they destroyed it. And Plato's dialogues are showing us what not to do. First of all, how to develop a beautiful democratic society, what sort of institutions to have to cultivate practical wisdom, and also how you can lose it all. And the most important factor in that is that you lose the telos, the final cause. You don't even know that the whole point of it was cultivating practical wisdom. You really think freedom for its own sake, freedom to get rich or powerful or to do nothing, that was the key, is that the Athenians completely lost their soul. They lost their mind. They lost not only their love of wisdom, they even lost any value of wisdom. They didn't even know that was the point. And so that was a problem. And Plato wrote his dialogues to get people to read them and talk about them, right? Sit around at the taverna, talk about Plato's dialogues. It seems to me at Plato's school, he probably performed the dialogues. Why not? Why not? Had students read them, maybe perform. There isn't quite as much going on in a Platonic dialogue, and then talk about the dialogue, right? Talking about talk. That's what the Athenians did after watching a tragedy. They talk about the talk and what the characters do. And in Plato, the characters are talking, but they're also always linked to their history, what they actually did. And so their incorrect, their mistake in judgment in their conversation with Socrates corresponds to a mistake in judgment they made as historical characters in their lives. And that mistake was part of what destroyed the free and open, self-sufficient society of Athens. So Plato is warning us. He's showing us how to build a democracy, and he's warning us about what we have to do, or what we better not do, to lose it. And he's trying to show us that it's political freedom the power to rule and be ruled in turn, to exercise practical wisdom, and intellectual freedom, free inquiry, science, medicine, the arts, the speculative thinking. This is what makes life worth living. This is the whole point. And they went and they destroyed it. And they didn't even know what they were doing. So Plato's trying to show you this is everything that makes life worth living. Do what you need to do to nurture it and preserve it for the next generation. And don't do anything that undermines